Thank you very much for coming out today for the Roundtable Discussion. My name is Fred White. I'm a professor of Russian and Integrated Studies here at UVU. Some of you may already know that we do not have what some might consider to be a standard Russian program. We actually work through integrated studies, and we have our students combine 2 minors out of the 70 minors available at UVU. And so most of our what we would call Russian majors here combine Russian studies with something else, national security studies, business management, so forth and so on. So I'm very excited today to get to lead this discussion because obviously this is a topic that needs our attention. I want to remind you all that this is also being live streamed, and we do have people watching pretty much all over the world. Today we're going to follow, if you don't mind, this schedule. I have several questions here that I'm going to ask our guests. Not every one of the individuals on the stage will answer every single question. We are going to have 3 responses per question, and then we're going to have what I am calling a reaction. A reaction is the individual will try to kind of summarize what was talked about, maybe fill in any gaps if something was maybe left unsaid, and we'll kind of go from there. I'm hoping to finish that up in about 75 minutes or so, 72 minutes, and that'll leave us about 15 minutes for an open discussion. I've then just been asked to give some very brief closing remarks, which I'll do no more than 5 minutes, I promise, and that'll bring our roundtable to a close. Okay, so thank you very much again for coming. Here we go. We're going to start with the first question, if you don't mind, and I'll direct this at the Honorable Consul of Poland, Dobrosława, Siemianowska. I'd like to know, how has the Russian invasion of Ukraine been received in your country over the last year?
Hear me? Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to this conference, for organizing. Thank you to the Utah Valley University for this opportunity. Since we have a little time just to answer our questions, I'll try to answer that. Well, as you know, as most of you know, a little bit of Polish history. Poland has an extensive experience with Russian imperialism. And in 2008, our late President Lech Kaczyński said, when Russia attacked Georgia, "Today it is Georgia, tomorrow it is Ukraine. The next day it's going to be the Baltic states, and then the day after that, it might be my country, Poland." So we've been living with that experience. We've been aware of that threat. And the last year, of course, it has been the reaction of the Polish government and the Polish people to the brutal aggression of Russia on Ukraine. So the Polish government has tried to support Ukraine in the efforts to defend herself, to provide Ukrainians with weapons, with munition, on bilateral basis, but also to support other states and encourage them to accelerate the military support for Ukraine. We also realized that, of course, this is not just an immediate threat to Ukraine, it is an immediate threat to our own security and Central and Eastern Europe. So being a NATO member country on its eastern flank, we also knew that we have to strengthen our own defense capacities. And that was a very difficult task to do, especially, you know, without depleting our own military potential aiding Ukraine. So for the past few years, Poland has been spending more than 2% of its GDP on defense purposes, and that has grown to 3% during the last year. And then last but not least, the society, the Polish people who had to react to what was happening. Every Pole wanted to have some agency, to do something facing what was going on. So 77% of Polish people are in some way engaged in providing assistance to Ukrainians. Well, sometimes it's just, giving a sleeping bag to someone, but still, it's the way it is. So it's been a very difficult year, but I think Ukrainians are having a definitely worse year than the Poles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to Consul General of Romania, Cosmin Dumitrescu, and I will ask the exact same question. How has the Russian invasion of Ukraine been received in your country over the last year?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored to come back again here. It's practically my second home here in the United States after Los Angeles. And congratulate the university for succeeding in putting together this nice image of solidarity. Because how Romania received in the last year the impact of the Russian aggression, illegal, unprecedented, unprovoked, illegitimate aggression against Ukraine, practically caused a multi-layered reaction, a very complex one. Romania, as well as Poland, is the most advanced NATO country in the eastern flank. And Romania has a long history of unfortunate and unhappy relations with Russia. Seeing the unthinkable happening, because nobody could think about any other possibility of having a war in Europe in 2022 or in 2014, of course that the reaction had to be multi-layered and divided on special and complex actions. The action of Romania as a member state in the European Union, the action of Romania and Romanian people as an ally, as a member of NATO, and of course the action of Romania as a friend of Ukraine. Of course that the military consolidation is a must, and Romania already had given more than 2% of the GDP for the military endowment and for its participation into NATO. At the same time, the position of Romania, together in solidarity with Ukraine, but aligned with the whole action of the European Union for supporting Ukraine, has been welcome and really efficient. And we'll come back to that at the next questions, if I may. At the same time, Romania has action with the partners in NATO in order to build on the eastern flank force enough to deter the Russian Federation about thinking of advancing. Then the reaction of Romania for helping, for supporting our Ukrainian friends and partners and brothers has been absolutely fantastic. And the percentage that Dobrosława, my friend and colleague, mentioned, of more than 70%, 72, 73% of the Romanians are somehow involved in helping in the humanitarian way, in the energy security field, and I must define it as multi-dimensional and comprehensive kind of sport. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, I'll turn to Consul General of Spain, Juan Sanchez, and ask the exact same question. How has the Russian invasion of Ukraine been received in your country over the last year?
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's for me a pleasure to be here. And I would like my colleagues to say hello and thanks to all of you who have invited me to be here, to my dear friend Baldomero Lago and all his team for organizing this. This is my third stay here. I would rather be in this morning talking about other issues, talking about climate change or water supply or whatever. But we're here to talk about Ukraine. Since 1 year ago, President of Russia, at the same time socially a thug, a bully, decided to break our system of security in Europe that was in force since World War II, and to ravage a neighboring country, destroy a society, and open the unknown for us, for all the Europeans. We are at the other side of Europe. We are not receiving, the effects of the conflict with the large extent of people, like my colleagues here from Romania or Poland. But we are European countries. We belong to the Western world. So we belong to the group of countries who have reached, the highest level of development in the world, mainly for one thing, for deciding freely, for the right to be wrong, and thus disappear overnight. We don't want this for the future. We are committed with those who are suffering, with those who are earning every day, with blood, sweat, and tears, the right to decide. So whatever thing we may do is good for the purpose of keeping Europe and keeping the world, not only Europe, but the world, free of those bullies. And this is our commitment, and that's what we are here as Europeans and friends of Ukraine, doing whatever is in our hands to help them and to try to end this madness as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Siegel, I'll turn to you. If you could maybe give some perspective from your side of a year in, the help that's been given by these countries and others. 3 minutes, please.
Okay. So I'm very skeptical about shows of solidarity. I prefer the phrase fragile unity because I think in some ways this is an everyday negotiation, but everything that I've heard here is true. And I think this is my lead off reading a lot of the reports recently from thinkers or people who are writing threads. I recently read a report by the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I mean, I'll just share this because it's Ivan Krastev, who's Bulgarian, who led this study. And one of the conclusions of it, in terms of this fragile unity, was that 3 factors have supported the remarkable coming together among EU and NATO countries, and those are, in order, Ukrainian successes in the first year of the war, the war's uniting of the political left and right, and I wonder if our commentators might speak about the environment in France and Germany because it's a little bit different there. And third, the perceived return of a strong West led by the United States. One of the results or findings of this study was that all of these kind of diplomatic relations are very fragile and constantly under negotiation. So I guess my big question in coming to the conclusion that there is a recognition of Russia as an adversary or as a rival, it seems that there, in many cases, at least in places like the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, there are historical reasons for this. I think West European countries and Americans should know a little bit more about Russian-Soviet occupations, especially in the course of the 20th century. But my question, I guess, would be in coming to this conclusion about unity, that Russia is actually not sort of the normal partner that you can do business with over energy or whatever it might be. How does that affect your domestic situation? Because in the United States, Ukraine has, as we know, in studying the candidates running up for Republicans and Democrats, DeSantis and so forth, up to 24, Ukraine is a political football, and it's a very, very hot topic right now to hold people accountable for their remarks, as once Mitt Romney was held accountable for his remarks in 2012 with his conversation with Obama. I wonder if there might be some comments here from our diplomats on two levels. So that is comparing your country's response to other countries, whether it's Sweden and Finland joining NATO or the Baltics plus Poland with their different experience of Russia, and then thinking about what might fracture that consensus. So it could be a Trump or a DeSantis or a political candidate on the left or the right who somehow changes tack. But I leave that as a kind of open question for those who are here to think about the reaction and what might continue through 2023.
Great, thank you. And we are going to have 15 minutes at the end to open this up to exactly that kind of question. I want to cover some of the big bases, though, before we get there. I want to move to the question of Ukrainian refugees, and specifically, is there a long-term plan for relocation of Ukrainians? And I'm going to start with Honorable Consul Siemianowska again and ask, especially I know that Poland has carried a brunt of the refugees leaving Ukraine, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that, please.
Yes, well, I rarely talk about numbers, but I think I'll just give you a few numbers roughly to show you the scale of things. There are 43 million or 44 million Ukrainian citizens. There are 38 million Polish citizens. And during the last year, we have faced an influx of 10 million Ukrainian citizens coming to Poland. 3.5 million Ukrainian citizens living in Poland right now. 1.5 million with a refugee status. And Poland's response has been very unique. We have Ukrainian guests. We do not have Ukrainian refugees. Polish people have opened their homes. 12% of Polish people actually host Ukrainians in their homes, houses, apartments, summer houses. And to give you the numbers, imagine every single homeless person in the United States finding a home in your homes, and now triple that number. That's how many there are. And of course, the immediate reaction when the aggression started was the people's reaction, because that was the easiest to provide. And people, as I said, were opening their hearts, their homes, and very soon the reaction of local governments and the central government followed. Already by mid-March 2022, we had a law passed by allowing Ukrainian citizens to settle, to register, to obtain a social security number in Poland, and to benefit from social services, from medical assistance. We have right now 197,000 children going to school. We believe that an interruption of educational process can be very difficult for children, difficult to go back to that. So providing schooling, but also making sure that Ukrainian children can remain in the Ukrainian system, to have schooling online. Polish government employed Ukrainian teachers to support Ukrainian children. So integration, but without the ability to continue to remain in Ukrainian culture, language, because that's something that's very important. And 95% of refugees in Poland are actually women and children. Men are fighting, of course. 60% of those people, of those refugees who can work, are actually working. So right now we have this situation where we have that community living with us. We had Ukrainian citizens living in Poland before the war. So we are used to each other, we know each other, we understand each other, and I just hope that every Ukrainian feels at home in Poland.
Thank you very much. I'll return to Honorable Consul Sanchez. Can you speak possibly to your country's reaction to the Ukrainian refugee situation and any thoughts on long-term relocation or?
Well, I would like to say a few words to answer what Professor Siegel was talking about. I'm aware that the war in Ukraine has turned into a long-term conflict in which a Russian autocrat is also campaigning to erode Western public opinion, which is facing increasing difficulty of obtaining vital energy. We have to change all our matrix in Europe, even food supplies, as well as undergoing high inflation. So it's a complex situation which could end up undermining the confidence, the trust in institutions and in countries. But I'm pretty confident for several reasons. Well, part of the first winter is passing, we almost can say that we have defeated General Winter for the first time, and this is good news. But although probably nothing that we could do is enough to answer the needs and the claims coming from Ukraine, we have done so many things that were unheard of and unseen in Europe, at least for so many years. We've changed everything there. Probably because we in the European Union the European Union was created to overcome the situation after World War II. We know what we have at stake. We know that we cannot share a future with a thug at our borders telling us, our Polish friend said, you know, the permanent threat of changing. Probably we have deserved this because we didn't answer, we didn't anything at all when Putin took the first measure to invade Crimea in 2014. We are now complaining of not doing much at that time. And probably for many years, Putin has been measuring, tailoring the lack of answer of the Western community. There's, you know, Crimea, Brexit, COVID. You know, I wouldn't say, well, our process of leaving Afghanistan, that it was not one of our best times or days to do so. Well, apart from that, we are trying to do what it is in our hands. In the case of Spain, we are receiving now, according to latest stats, 170,000 Ukrainian refugees. They can obtain, they get, you know, a permanent residence in a process that takes no more than 48 hours in a police station, granting them to be there, to work there, if they want, to receive universal health care. And those children who are till 16 years of age, they are compulsory go to a high school. There's no problem with that. There is even a situation to recognize driver's license, whatever. They can stay over there under permanent basis. So no problem for that. In our case, we have the capability of admitting that and able to cope with that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Honorary Consul of Ukraine, Dmytro Kushneruk, and I would like you, if you don't mind, to speak to the issue of Ukrainian refugees and the plan going forward.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank Baldomero Lago and UVU for organizing this conference and for devoting the topic of this year's conference to Ukraine, because it's the most important thing right now, for us at least. And first of all, this issue of refugees, I would like to say that in Ukraine, we don't use this word. We call them a temporarily displaced person, and the key word is temporarily. And secondly, among the millions who left Ukraine and went to Europe, there are 5 million of internally displaced persons who left their homes at the front line and relocated to the western part of the country. And third, we will, of course, will never get tired to say thanks to, first of all, Poland and also Romania, who are the bordering countries and which received huge amount of Ukrainians first days of the war, opened the borders, like people could leave without even having a passport, any foreign passport, just any passport at all. So that means a lot. We'll never forget this. It is very sincere. Also to Spain as well, because they received also lots of Ukrainians. Then, as we're here in the United States, I would like to comment on the question I'm being often asked, like how many Ukrainians have come here to the United States since the beginning of the war. And according to the information we have, so this so-called U4U, Uniting for Ukraine program, since it has been introduced, 220,000 applications have been filed by, it's not by Ukrainians, but by receiving hosting families. Among them, 150,000 approved and 120,000 have arrived to the United States. Of them, the leaders in the United States are New York State, Illinois, and California. But Utah is not in the top 10, but maybe given to the percentage of the population, the number is still big, and we appreciate the support from the state of Utah. Thank you very much for that. And of course, the refugees which were leaving Ukraine going to Poland first days of the war, and those who come to the United States are different probably categories of people, because the here is more like a conscious choice to go. Also, what I want to say is that we all remember that at the beginning of the war, there were not so many countries willing to help Ukraine with military aid, but mostly were helping with refugees. And those, for example, it does not refer to Poland in any case, because they're helping a lot military. But the Germany, for example, first maybe months of the war, they were saying, oh, come on, we cannot help you with military, but we accepted so many refugees. But now it changed, and even the Germany has become one of the leaders of the European Union in terms of providing Ukraine with military equipment like Leopards, tanks, and so on and so on. And also, by the way, the Romania and Spain have always provided also to Ukraine a lot of military aid. Spain provided air defense, and Romania a lot of ammunition and other things. Because this is really the most important thing for us Ukrainians right now, and it's also connected with our Ukrainian refugees. But because the sooner we get the help that we need, the sooner we will get the victory in the war, and the refugees can come back to Ukraine. And this is our eventual goal. Our plan for relocation of Ukrainians is to have all of them come back and take part in the rebuilding of Ukraine. And we hope that majority of them will eventually come back, and this will help sooner than later.
Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce now, or bring in as our reaction to those three, Mr. Ryan Guirlinger, who's on the screen here. He is the political unit chief in the Office of Eastern European Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Guirlinger, thank you for joining us from afar. Can you speak a little bit to what's already been said, and maybe possibly the partial reaction of the U.S. to this question?
Certainly, thank you, and thanks very much for the invitation and for having me. Everyone can hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Certainly, on the topic of refugees, you know, the rest of the other panelists have laid out the numbers, and what's really striking is just the sheer numbers that we're talking about between refugees, internally displaced persons, temporarily displaced persons, the various ways we describe them. I think one of the key things that we look at, and I know there's a question later on reconstruction, but is the eventual return of those who've left Ukraine and the key role that they'll play in reconstruction. Just because when you're talking about that many people who've left, that's a key element of the workforce. And you know, unfortunately, due to Putin's aggression and the way that he's tried to wreak that devastation on Ukraine and its people, there's just such a massive job there that there's going to be, in addition from the monetary side, there's just a people side that's going to be needed to rebuild Ukraine. And having the conditions right for people to return is going to be a huge part of that, and that cuts across everything: security, economic, political, getting all that right so that not only is there eventually at some point some sort of peace, or at least, you know, something like it that allows for Ukraine to start to rebuild, but then also for people to return and join into that. You know, the mention of the amounts, you know, that especially with the example of Germany and others, Poland, certainly all the countries on the panel that have spent to house and support the refugees. This is something that we at the State Department often turn to, because as you mentioned at the top, there's the political calendar, and there's the various opinions throughout this town here in Washington about our support for Ukraine. And while that's very, very united at the moment, there's always questions coming from Congress about, you know, how much is this, if you look at the charts, the financial outlays from the United States, especially if you look on the security assistance side, are just so much more massive from the U.S. side than from our European partners. But if you look at it, you know, diving in in terms of percentage of GDP, and then also when you incorporate not just the security support, the budget support to Ukraine, but also the amount spent on refugees inside countries that are hosting them, then that's a much, much more even picture. And so this is part of the story that we're continually trying to tell with Congress, with our elected representatives, and also with the American people, that it's, while the United States may be leading in a lot of ways, we're not alone in our actions here.
Great, thank you so much. Moving on to our third question, then I'd like to turn to Honorable Consul Dumitrescu. How has the war influenced your discussions of energy and food security? This is a question that you felt very strongly about, so I turn to you first.
Thank you very much for the question and for putting it in the schedule. I think that when we talk about energy security and food security aspects that practically affect everybody at the global level, and it's deeply affected by the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, we should make the resemblance with the other aspects of this war of aggression, and with the reaction of the international community. What we have here in this room right now, we have in the western part of the United States put together Poland, Ukraine, Romania, a professor from Texas. We have the Department of State present personally with Director Shen and our partner from DC. We have the students who want to listen from. We have religious leaders, and all of them stand together in solidarity and work together in order to countermeasure the aggression. And nothing could be done without this solidarity. And before I tackle the food and energy security aspects, I would like to express on behalf of my government, but I think I can do it on behalf of the European Union as well, to express our gratitude, how grateful we are for the unwavering support of the US in all these aspects. And it's true that the contribution coming from here, financially speaking, but not only, are huge, these contributions. And without these contributions and support of the US, the situation would be really difficult for the European Union. And now I pass to the energy security thing. Without the support of the United States with the LNG transports to the European Union, it will be really difficult for the member states of the European Union to pass the winter, because many member states of the European Union were dependent on the energy imported from the Russian Federation. And I think some of you know that I began writing some articles about that in 2015, 2016, about how the Russian Federation is using that as a blackmail tool, the energy. And I call it an energy weapon, and how we should work together in order to avoid that kind of dependency. And I think that we succeeded in doing that, and we practically proved that solidarity was not broken by using this kind of energy blackmail. And that was possible with the support of the United States as well. And for the energy security, we know that how important it is for Ukraine to find the lanes for exporting these goods. It's of utmost importance for financing the resources for the war. And these solidarity lanes that were organized there helped with the exportation of more than 23 million tons of Ukrainian grains. And those measures are continuing, and we are sure that everybody is going to support it, being really necessary not only for Europe, but also for what we call in diplomacy the global south that could face famine. So thank you very much, and we'll continue at the end of it.
Absolutely, thank you. Honorable Consul Kushneruk, could you explain to us kind of your position right now on issues of energy security and food security?
Thanks for that. Yes, first of all, thank you, Consul Dumitrescu, for raising that and for highlighting the specific highlights on this problem, because yes, it's our exact understanding that Europe for years have been too much dependent on Russia, on Russian energy sources, and even though US, I believe, was kind of pushing forward that you got to lessen this dependence on Russian energy. Now, this war that Russians start finally opened the eyes for probably everyone in the whole world and in Europe, first of all, and these Russian plans to freeze Europe, they failed because of the US support, so we thank the United States for the support for that as well. And also, for us, for Ukrainians, this energy security and food security, they're both 2 points, 2 elements of the 10-point peace plan, peace formula proposed by President Zelensky several months ago, which became the items of the also United Nations resolution, which were adopted last month. This resolution was called the Principles Underlying Comprehensive and Lasting Peace in Ukraine, which was adopted by 141 countries. And by the way, this helped fight this Russian myth that it's only the West supports Ukraine. In fact, 141 countries means that majority, absolute majority of the world supports. So for us, energy security also includes nuclear security and safety, and we should make sure that Russia withdraws its forces from Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's the biggest one in Europe, actually, which was producing 6 gigawatts of power, and also to avoid the threat of hunger by furthering the Black Sea Grain Initiative and countering Russian efforts to undermine it, as well as by developing our Grain from Ukraine initiative. And you know that this grain initiative, it was extended now. It was extended for 4 months, but Russia is threatening to cancel that in 2 months if Russia is not allowed to export its own. And the other important thing about the energy and food, by the way, as well, is that by stopping importing energy from Russia, you're not just creating your independence, but you're also depriving Russia of the funds to fuel and fund the war. And this is very important because every dollar spent by countries who import Russian fossil fuels, gas and oil, all these dollars are spent to kill Ukrainians. That's why we call on every country to stop doing that. And also, the Ukrainian harvest this year will be 20%, at least 20% less. So less will be exported to the countries in Northern Africa and Middle East, which were one of the biggest targets where Ukraine was exporting that. And we should also prevent the energy crisis, which will require cessation of Russian missile terror against Ukrainian power infrastructure. It's needless to remind that Russia, since October, has performed 18 massive missile attacks, more than 50 missiles each at our critical infrastructure, power infrastructure, targeting the production, power generation, and distribution. So they fired more than 700 missiles and about 1,000 Iranian-made suicide drones. And luckily right now we don't have the power outages, but that's partially because we're, since the beginning of the war, our electric grid was disconnected from Russia, but connected with the European Union. And when we had a very bad situation, that helped us a lot, and hopefully when we will be able to restore it, we'll be exporting energy again as we did before.
Thank you very much. Mr. Guirlinger, I turn to you now to speak about the U.S. position on energy security and food security challenges, please.
Sure. So, I mean, we've been had active discussions on both of these topics, since before February of last year. But, definitely the full-scale invasion really focused our conversations there. I think on food security, as other panelists have talked about with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, I mean, that's been a huge focus, is supporting the arrangements brokered by the UN and by Turkey to facilitate the flow of grain out of Ukraine. I think one really illustrative thing to look at is back in the fall, when there was the previous discussion of rolling over and extending the initiative, which was initially set up in July. There was a period in time where actually Russia suspended its participation and had threatened to then disrupt flow of grain out of Ukrainian ports, but they never made good on that threat. And in addition, one other thing, one piece of data that we took out of that was that Russia slows down the inspections of these ships leaving the ports to the point where usually there's about 3 or 4 that leave every day. Well, in that time where Russia suspended its participation, there were more than 40 ships leaving every day. And so it really just shows how Russia is trying to control the narrative, and then when we're actually able to break through that and expose its true actions, see just how much it's working to undermine global food security, with its actions that it's taken against Ukraine. And so that's really the challenge that we are up against, and that we keep pushing to have this initiative be renewed and be renewed for longer, to make sure that those vital food supplies can get out to a lot of markets that are very, very dependent on grain coming from Ukraine or from the region. On energy security, certainly we've had conversations for years about the importance of energy diversification. I mean, going back to the very beginning of my career about 15 years ago, we had that in the context of sort of diversification away from an over-reliance on oil coming from the Gulf. But it's been part of the, then we've had conversations about it in the climate context, for more renewable energy and those goals and why we would be supporting it. The war has then just focused even more needing to have that diversification. Unfortunately, we've had a few factors, a relatively mild winter in Europe, and the surge in U.S. LNG that's been able to come online. At the same time, we're always cognizant of the vast majority of U.S. LNG comes out of the Gulf of Mexico, and we get a hurricane in August or September, and we could have disruptions there. So it's important to continue to diversify. This U.S. LNG has been great, and we certainly absolutely have been at the forefront of pushing it and getting it out to our European allies, and helping to structure contracts and things. I mean, the effort last year to move supply around the world, that was just massive to fill the gap. It's been very, very successful. And when you consider that 14 months ago how much of Europe's gas supply depended on Russia, and today it is way, 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 way down to the point where many, many countries have cut it off completely. That's a huge success, but we also have to be prepared for making sure that over-reliance one way or another doesn't create other vulnerabilities.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Professor Siegel, your reaction.
So thank you to these really interesting comments. I'm actually learning quite a lot just listening to you about food and energy security. So I would say to the audience here, definitely read the fine print for Blinken's statements and the Ukrainian Supplemental Appropriations Act from, I think it's January 2023. So I think that's really important. One thing we haven't talked about yet is China, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but I actually think this is a really important question in terms of liquefied natural gas if we drill down into the details of this, because there are so many contingent factors right now, and now that China is reaching out to the Russian Federation to make it its resource colony or whatever you want to call it, and Japan is reaching out to Kiev. I think that the China factor is kind of the elephant in the room here that we really need to talk about, or at least I would like to talk about, given the fact that there's now time to prepare for the next winter. And in reading a lot of the statements, I think that we're at the moment where it's gone from a sprint to a marathon, from short term to long term. I wonder if our diplomats as respondents might talk about the China question. And what I mean, I think, concretely here is with demand. So reduced demand, as I see it, given like the statistics out of China, partly due to COVID and COVID-related restrictions for LNG. I'm not sure that's going to happen for 2023, 2024, but it's a really interesting question. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, absolutely, I think needing more support and probably more money and more transatlantic partnership for sure. I guess I would also, add one more kind of big question to this, because decarbonization is a word that we haven't used yet, but I'm looking for ways to make the supply chains more efficient. And what I mean by that is if those of you who are working from Romania or who are working from Poland have had experience in your own departments of energy bilaterally with Ukraine or in some kind of energy environment, I wonder if you might speak to the difficulties that you've seen in the supply, really, I think, with even things like electricity. So I know this is such a huge priority in Ukraine right now with the Department of Energy. Seeing Kharkiv without electricity for 3 months for me was just kind of like tragic, because I live there, I work there, I know journalists on the ground there. I cannot possibly see that, happening for another winter, or at least I would not want to see that. These strike me as problems that can be solved, at least in the energy environment or the electricity environment. So China and supply chain issues that are real logistical problems. And I do this, from the University of Texas, where we have something called the Global Disinformation Lab. I'm tracking migration, refugees. I'm looking at things along the border. I have colleagues like Margarita Balmaceda, who's an old friend of mine, who wrote a book on energy policy and supply issues. So those are, I think, big concerns that can lead into more conversations. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And we will return to China for sure. I want to get to the notion of reconstruction of Ukraine and possibly conversations about foreign investment. President Zelensky went to the World Bank just recently. So I'll start with Honorable Consul Kushneruk, and I'll ask you about the issue of reconstruction, foreign investment, so forth and so on.
Thanks. So first of all, I'd like to mention that people who are in Ukraine responsible for this reconstruction, they try not to use the word reconstruction or rebuilding. They would try to use the word reimagine or redesigning Ukraine, because the idea is not to use just to rebuild what was done before, like the old way to do that, but to use this opportunity to build a new Ukraine using the new approaches, new technologies, all of things like that. And the most important thing is that we in Ukraine, we want to do this rebuilding and right now, not wait until the end of the war, because sometimes it's difficult to persuade about that. But that's the war, which unfortunately is happening in the 21st century, and the approaches also are different. And currently, probably Ukrainian recovery program will be the largest project in Europe, and also provide the new impetus to European economy as well. And this year, 2023, our Ukraine recovery, we will have our 4 main areas, that is energy, housing, demining, and critical infrastructure. And the new joint assessment released on the 23rd of March, just recently, by the government of Ukraine and World Bank and European Commission and United Nations, is the assessment of the funds which will be necessary because of the losses has grown up to $411 billion. And this cost of reconstruction and recovery is expected to stretch over the 10 years and combines both needs for public and private funds. So we, of course, very much appreciate the financial assistance provided from our partners. And G7 countries have committed $9 billion as of now, and another 17 is needed this year to rebuild the energy sector to be prepared for the next year. The multi-agency donor coordination platform to support Ukraine's repair has been created, so-called financial Rammstein. It's called that way because Rammstein is where it's been discussed how to provide military aid to Ukraine, but this is now a financial Rammstein, where the different countries' officials as well as all the international financial institutions gather together and think about how these funds can be provided. So also the question is from where this money should come from, and there can be 4 different sources. One is this Russian frozen assets, which we hope will become confiscated, and we believe it should be the main source of that, not to create the burden on any country's taxpayers. Also the international financial organizations and foreign agencies assistance, Ukraine's state fund money, and the foreign direct investments. And speaking of the foreign direct investments, we already have support. President Zelensky talked with them, with such huge corporations as BlackRock, as Goldman Sachs, and many others, as well as, of course, International Monetary Fund, which has just recently approved this $14 billion program for Ukraine. So all of that, and we believe foreign investments will be definitely, for sure, leading in that process at some point. Now it's difficult to persuade foreign private investors to come into a country which is still kind of at war. But it's at the same time, there will never be the same opportunity for a foreign investor to come in Ukraine as it is right now, because after the war will be over, the recovery will be very huge, and it will be not the same opportunities to come. And Ukraine, as President Zelensky says, is the biggest opportunity in Europe since the Second World War.
Thank you. Mr. Guirlinger, then the idea of reimagining, not reconstructing, reimagining Ukraine from the State Department's side?
Sure, yes. As Consul General Kushneruk said, yes, I've heard the term Ukraine 2.0 used a lot to describe Kyiv's vision for the recovery or the reimagining. Within the U.S. government, the U.S. Agency for International Development has the lead on a lot of our thoughts and our discussions on this reimagining and recovery. So far, the roughly $15.5 billion that the United States has given for direct budgetary support to Ukraine over the last little more than a year has going through the World Bank. That's mostly been for current needs. There's another, I think, close to $7.5 billion that's projected through September of this year. But at the same time, we're not just focused on the now, we're focused on the future as well. And as Mr. Kushneruk said, there's a lot of different sources for where that recovery is going to come from. The key part of getting the private sector and also in some ways public from international into Ukraine is for the structure to be attractive and to be conducive to that investment. And so a lot of our conversations are on reforms, and a lot of this is, I don't want to speak for my European colleagues, but a lot of this is tied to and led by the EU accession, the EU candidacy potential, and various benchmarks that will be on the way there that then are there not just in support of eventual path to EU accession, but also are elements that will create a more conducive and attractive investment environment to bring in and take advantage of that opportunity. Just on the topic of asset seizure, that's certainly something that's being looked at. Russian frozen assets. It's quite complicated because of the exposure of other U.S. businesses or U.S. government assets overseas and where they are in various countries. The international legal framework for such is very, very convoluted and not quite clear. A lot of what we're dealing with in that realm in many realms, considering this conflict, is just unprecedented territory for international law, or at least the international law system that's been set up since 1945, because the system never really contemplated that a UN Security Council permanent member would invade a sovereign other UN member, and so that dealing with that then means working through a lot of different variations to try to come up with actionable things that can be done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Honorable Consul Dumitrescu, can you speak to us your position then on this idea of reimagining Ukraine?
Thank you. It's not reimagining, it's rebuilding, reconstructing, and consolidating. I would connect just a bit some of the remarks of Professor Siegel with the efforts of reconstructions and recovery after the war, and during the war as well. You were talking about bilateral cooperation regarding energy security between Romania and Ukraine, and I thank you for that. The situation is even better. There is a trilateral cooperation in that field between Romania, Ukraine, and the Republic of Moldova. And the three Ministers of Energies have just met in Chisinau for putting a basis for that cooperation. And Romania is highly engaged in providing the necessary resources to Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova in order to avoid any or at least to diminish any damage that is caused by that lack of energy. So Romania stated that and stands by its promise, having this trilateral cooperation, and that goes immediately to the reconstruction efforts. This aggression is the most terrifying, terrible man-made disaster in Europe after the Second World War. And as any disaster management, people that are going to work for recovery and reconstruction first act in order to recover the essential systems. That is the infrastructure for energy, for health, for transport, for schooling, and housing. In that order. Romania has already expressed its will and engagement in order to participate directly with many resources in the reconstruction of Ukraine, and also to support all the international efforts and intervention that are going to be active in the whole process of Ukraine reconstruction. That is so complex, so long, as my colleague and friend Consul General Kushneruk mentioned. And also the mention of Ryan Guirlinger that some of the resources will come from the European Union and that practically respond to two necessities, not only complying with the conditions for the accession of the EU, but also for helping at the reconstruction of Ukraine, is a truth that is going to happen. And I'm sure that the whole international effort together will help Ukraine to recover as soon as possible. It's going to be a national effort from Ukrainians, supported, highly supported by the international efforts of all civilized countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Consul Siemianowska, would you like to offer a reaction, please?
Yes, thank you. So I like the word redesigning Ukraine, and I think Dmytro, you spoke about new rules for redesigning, rebuilding energy sector, housing, demining, and critical infrastructure. But I think what Ukraine is facing now, what the society is facing now, is rebuilding, redesigning the society, the people who are taking things back into their hands. And I think that should also set the rules for the future rebuilding of the state, meaning we need to listen to Ukraine, what Ukraine really needs. I mean, the investment must be based on that rule, on the choice of the Ukrainian people, and not only what we want to offer. I think that this equal participation of Ukrainian citizens in the wealth in the new of the new country is the key to this investment. We cannot talk about Marshall Plan. We should talk about discussion. We should discuss that with the Ukrainians. And I also think what Cosmin has just said. I believe that the fact that Ukraine has now been granted a candidate status in the EU, and also the potential of becoming a NATO member, this should also set the track for rebuilding. We will be assisting in rebuilding a potential NATO and EU member. This is not going to be some peripheral state. It's going to be one of our partners. So that's, I think, it's the mindset that we have to have when talking about rebuilding.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. I'd like to switch now a little bit the focus to thoughts about the effectiveness of sanctions on Russia, and I'm going to turn to Mr. Guirlinger to start us off. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of those sanctions?
Sure, so I had to speak with my colleagues who cover Russia a bit since I focus more on Ukraine. But I think, we view that the sanctions are being effective. I mean, I think one thing that's very striking about it is the solidarity and just the wide, range of partners and allies who are part of the development of these sanctions and then their enforcement. The goals are to deprive Russia of resources for its war and its imperial project, and reducing international reliance on Russia. We've seen the effects on the battlefield that Russia is, unfortunately still launching, many things at Ukraine, but it's not able to buy the critical elements that it needs for many of these systems, for many of the most high-tech ones. We're talking about optical systems, intelligence, computer chips, that sort of thing. The stories of, Russia cannibalizing washing machines and other products that they're bringing in through Central Asia, just underscores that the sanctions are being effective. This also means that there's, in some ways, it's being pushed around, and we have to continually seek to find where the activity has been moved and then try to push there. It's in order that we can maintain this effectiveness. There's a verifiable impact on the Russian economy that has contracted over the last year. I do want to say that, of course, the goal is not the collapse of the Russian economy. That's not going to happen, and that's not our objective. The objective of the sanctions is to be effective enough to affect its ability to fight the war. And the longer that it goes on, we see Russia is pivoting, or potentially moving to other sources. Professor Siegel mentioned China. There's the Iran relationship as well. All of which are, I think there's arguments over the sustainability of aspects of that over the long term for Russia. And so, certainly, I think the sanctions are here for the long haul until, there's some sort of a change in Russian thinking and in Russia's willingness to be a reliable, negotiator, to come with full faith to peace negotiations at some point down the road. There's no plans for the sanctions to be lifted, at any point, barring a major, decision by Russia to no longer pursue the war.
Thank you. Honorable Consul Sanchez, your thoughts from the Spanish position.
Thank you. Well, for me, the first sanction that worked really well was what the unexpected was the determination of the Ukrainian people to fight, to respond. The second, unexpected as well, after, was the real response of the Western allies, or the determination as well. So this is working, and it's part of the solution. Probably it's difficult to know now the real impact of sanctions, our esteemed colleague of the Department of State has said. Because many of these, well, first of all, is for us, we've done a lot of things in Europe, can say figures later on about the change in our supply of gas and whatever, but it's impossible to make a complete decoupling in 1 year, the supply of hydrocarbons, for example. And then, as Mr. Guirlinger has said, the sanctions didn't have, like in the past, the provision of punishing third countries that trade with Russia. So Russia has tried to look for other suppliers, and you see that the exports, the European exports have plummeted, but the exports for Turkey, for all former Soviet republics, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, has skyrocketed at the same time. Even those, the export of fruits and vegetables coming from Israel. So, in fact, we have done as much as possible, but the real thing is now we know what it is at stake, but we know what we have to do. I'm probably answering what Mr. Siegel said prior. Now we have something to design about the future of our commitment. First, the transatlantic commitment between Europe and the US. And even in the field of NATO, we talk about later, when we held the NATO summit in Madrid, there were not only NATO countries present there. There were also Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So that we are trying to foresee or to anticipate the future. And probably what is going to be at stake is how to make effective decoupling from China, not to ignoring what China is bringing, but they say now that from the nearshoring we have to take care of the friendshoring, to know what it is at our side, to change the patterns, the matrix of many things, and to try to design another kind of future, knowing that we have to do many things by ourselves. Probably after COVID, we were thinking about that, and now after Ukraine, we have to think about that.
Wonderful, thank you. Honorable Consul Siemianowska, from the Polish position, sanctions on Russia.
Well, Polish position is also a EU position, of course, and European Union has taken immense efforts with the sanctions. I believe that it all depends on international solidarity. The European Union is also working towards that. We had a sanctions coordinators forum with like-minded countries, and as Spanish Consul has just mentioned, with Japan, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand. So tightening that system definitely makes it more effective. Naturally, Russia is trying to circumvent those sanctions, and of course we should also think about aligning them with sanctions towards, let's say, Belarus. So that's one thing to think about. But if you ask a simple question, are sanctions effective? Well, no, since Putin did not withdraw, and is that the way to think about sanctions? I don't think it is. It's very unrealistic or naive even. I'm looking at these issues from more sociological perspective as well. I mean, we can talk about politics, economy, etc., but we should also think about the Russian people, the Russian society. So is the fact that a Russian girl cannot buy an iPhone in Russia anymore, is that going to change the war? Well, no, but I think that in a way it gives a signal, it sends a signal that this social agreement that has been working so far. We, the society, will not talk much about politics, will not intervene what is going on in the Kremlin, and you, the Kremlin and the security services will provide stability and access to all the Western, goods or Western style of living. And now I think, if a regular guy somewhere in Kazan cannot buy a reasonably priced used Toyota, that sends him a signal as well. And I hope that those little signals are little drops that can actually start a corrosion in the society and somehow ferment it from the inside. If I'm naive thinking that, well, I'm hopeful.
Great, thank you. Professor Siegel, your reaction.
Yeah, these are really great comments, and I think the question about pivoting is also really important at the moment. So not just pivoting to China, but pivoting to, as the Russian Federation is doing, toward Iran and North Korea, especially for manufacturing and weapons supply. On the issue of sanctions, I guess I would just do this in my boring academic way and pose it as a kind of thought experiment, reading some of the literature on sanctions, thinking about the impact or lack thereof on other authoritarian or authoritarian-genocidal regimes. So if we're thinking in the larger world, we're thinking about the impact of 20 years of sanctions on Sudan. That would be a good example. We're also thinking about the effect it has had or hasn't had on Assad in Syria. So, I mean, certainly, it's crippled the Syrian economy, one might say, by 40% or even by half, and yet he still stands, right? And as for Venezuela, which might be for you, Juan, thinking about the effect it's had on the Venezuelan economy, it might be 2/3 to 3/4. It might be somewhere around there, and yet it still stands. So I think, at least from what I read, the United States is interested in functioning like the G7 in a hard power world. This is something I think that the French and Germans are not quite used to, at least not quite yet. But those questions are hard because they require asking what Russian objectives actually are, and nobody can read Putin's mind, including the people that you see up here on stage. So there are small kind of tactics that one can engage in. So hiking tariffs on aluminum exports, right? Boring stuff, cutting off access to semiconductors and high-tech products. Whether that becomes U.S. policy or not, those are definitely ways of sort of reaching beyond the consensus issue that might be freezing Russian assets and having Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government use that. So this is just one way of me saying that sanctions are not always successful, but they're part of larger, sort of functioning proposals in hard power situations that we, might not be used to, at least our EU allies, if I speak as an American here, are not used to quite yet. And that question about Russia's maximalist goals, I think we just, not to do Kremlinology, because I know, Fred, you don't like this, and I don't like it either, but we do have to ask what the Russian time frame is and the objectives and how they might respond to sanctions. Russia had a 5% growth in 2021. It had a 2% contraction in 2022. Some had predicted 10%, but certainly the sanctions have, I would argue, even though they sound good, have not had the effect that some, had imagined they would have.
Thank you. We're going to move, and thank you for following the time. I appreciate it very much. We are on the last kind of set question, and then we're going to open it up, because obviously I knew that having these set questions would then bring forth a whole series of other questions. So we'll get through this kind of last one, and then we're going to free it up. I'm going to turn to you, Honorable Consul Kushneruk, and it's already been, the issue's been raised, but could you speak about the path forward to inclusion of Ukraine in organizations such as the EU and possibly even NATO?
Yeah, if you allow me, just quickly comment on the sanctions as well, because there are definitely sanctions that work. Because just I believe yesterday, a telephone conversation interception has become public between one Russian oligarch, like a billionaire, and one producer, Prigozhin, not the Prigozhin from Wagner, but another one, but still. And pretty interesting that that billionaire is complaining to him that he's suffering from sanctions a lot. So on a personal level, the sanction, I mean, he cannot really, use his credit card in US dollars or to pay for something, despite the fact he has billions of dollars. So on a personal level, personal sanctions work. On the sectoral level, we would be happy if they work more. And by the way, the sanctions should be expanded to on Russia and Belarus as well, because of the recent statements from Putin that he's going to provide nuclear weapons to Belarus. And after that, we have already heard on the Belarus TV propaganda that they are threatening to use that against Poland openly, and those crazy guys. Even though we definitely see Ukraine in NATO and European Union, and first of all, let's be frank, the decision that not to provide Ukraine and Georgia a partnership action plan to NATO in 2008 in Bucharest summit, it was a mistake. It was at the time supported by the United States very strongly, but the other countries of Europe, some of them did not support because they were afraid, let's not provoke Putin. And okay, nobody provoked Putin, but still he attacked Georgia the same year, 2008. They annexed Crimea in 2014, and now full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So this logic really doesn't work, and that's why, the worst has happened already. So that's why nobody should be afraid of Putin doing something, and everybody can see now that Russia, in fact, can be stopped and definitely can be defeated. So that's why Ukraine has to become a member of NATO. And, because the fact that Ukraine was not in NATO, it actually preceded Putin that, okay, I can attack and there will be no consequences for me for that, because no one will protect. Well, the reality proved to be different, and the NATO was become much more united, which is a very good thing. But at the same time, and now the only real security guarantees in the world that work is the NATO guarantees. That's the reason why even the smaller Baltic states can feel themselves quite secure and can speak openly and on what they think, because they are protected by Article 5. And that's what we need for Ukraine. And the Ukrainian army currently is, of course, the strongest in Europe. It's the biggest in number, and also with the help of the NATO technologies, NATO weapons, it's definitely stronger. So it will benefit NATO, in fact, as well. And after, our President Zelensky has that kind of Ukraine de facto joined NATO already, because we are training to the same standards, we're using the same kind of weapons, but also we have a trust between each other, which is the most important thing between allies. And NATO also helps protect Ukraine right now by providing the weapons, and Ukraine protects NATO at the same time from Russian threat. And after this heroic struggle against Russian aggression, Ukraine has deserved its right to become a member of NATO and a member of the European Union. And that's why in September Ukraine has submitted the application to join NATO and also the European Union. And hopefully at the Vilnius summit, we expect to hear some good news about whether we'll be able to use the accelerated procedure of joining NATO, which the Finland and Sweden are now taking. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Honorable Consul Sanchez, please, could you speak to the issue of Ukraine's path towards EU membership or NATO membership or both?
Well, quick answer to say other things. Spain is ready to support any decision taken by the Ukrainians in order to join European Union and even NATO if they want to, for sure. But let me say other things, to think about. Well, who's Putin? Putin is an autocrat, former KGB boy, is indoctrinated in the beliefs of Mother Russia. There's a guy who despises the predecessors because they blame for Russian decline to Gorbachev, Putin, and so on. So he deployed his own version of a military, economic, industrial complex. We are surrounded by some tycoons. Let me tell you some figures. Spain is a country that is 40 times smaller than Russia in size and 4 times smaller in population. But we have the same GDP than Russia, and we are not the richest ones in Europe. So you don't build an empire with these figures. Let me tell you something. Putin is not the aggression on Ukraine is not a military issue. The NATO was very careful not to establish, not to open facilities in the former countries of the Warsaw Pact. And now, the American soldiers stationed in Europe at 80,000, around 80,000. It's a third of the number that were in the mid-90s. So it's not a matter of military threat on Russia. So why Ukraine? Well, there are many things at stake. For me, the main reason is that Putin doesn't want to have their unsuccessful process of westernization. A modern society, a free society. Better to have something like puppet state, like Lukashenko, Belarus, or even a barren wasteland, a fire, a wall, something like that, not in the middle. Because you have something that prevents you this contagion that is even more possible with a society like Ukrainian that is very dual, with a culture that share with the Russians, even with the language, with a lot of family ties now shattered by Putin's folly. That's the main reason. For me, that is a kind of opinion. Probably there are more elaborated in the field, but we stand ready to do anything that Ukrainians want.
Thank you very much. Honorable Consul Siemianowska, you've spoken a little bit about this, but again, maybe that pathway, some insights into that?
Yeah, I think the subject of future potential EU and NATO memberships are very much interwoven with the topic of rebuilding Ukraine. But let me underline one thing. Poland wholeheartedly notices and recognizes the immense efforts of Ukraine. I mean, despite the ongoing war, the reforms taking place, the legal initiatives taking place to bring Ukraine closer to the Euro-Atlantic community. And Poland also supports your path to both EU and NATO membership. But being a relatively new EU country, Poland is, although it's been almost 19 years. But I can still remember that it was, of course, a very painstaking and lengthy process. And it was years of negotiations, years of merit-based checking of Polish regulations being modified to suit the EU rules. So there is a huge and immense, actually, amount of work still ahead. As far as NATO is concerned, I hope that the Vilnius summit will not repeat just the language from Bucharest from 2008. And I think at this very moment, we are and we will be concentrating on political support, on practical cooperation, and I think that's for the time being the path that is being taken.
Thank you. Fantastic. And then final reaction from Honorable Consul Dumitrescu.
Thank you, Fredrick. You will despair. It's final, but it's long. Not that long. So, very good question. Regarding the effectiveness of sanctions, I will support the opinion of Ryan Guirlinger and all the ones expressed here. I think it's obvious that against the narrative, in spite of the narrative of the Russian Federation, the sanctions are effective. We can see that because we can see the contraction of the Russian economy, and we can see that there are some pieces of museum on the streets sent to fight a war by the Russian military. So that military industrial complex has some issues in funding, maybe. And also the reaction of the business environment there could be discouraging for the regime because they are directly affected by these sanctions. So I think that the international community, and we think that the international community should continue with that. And Romania is a big supporter of all the 10 waves of sanctions and to continue doing that as well. About the accession and the pathway to accession as a member of EU and of NATO. I begin with NATO. Romania has constantly and in a very transparent manner supported the policy of open doors for NATO, and also for the implementation of the decisions taken at the summit, NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008. As a matter of fact, that was also expressed again by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania, the last reunion, NATO reunion of the foreign ministers in 29 November 2022. So from that point of view, the Romanian position, I think, is crystal clear. And of course, that should be supported by things that need to be done for the compliance with all the conditions as a NATO member. And that goes for the EU accession as well. I think that all the pathway of transformation, of reforming the society that we crossed, I think I speak about Romania right now, as Poland talked about Poland, on our way to becoming a member state of the EU will be successfully accomplished by the Ukrainian nation and Ukraine. And Romania has repeatedly expressed its support, direct support, not only in helping doing that and also sharing from our own experience, from our own pathway of becoming a NATO and EU members. And that was repeatedly expressed at the highest level when the Prime Minister of Romania and the head of the President of the Parliament, of the Chambers of Deputies, visited in April Kyiv together, and when the Romanian President Klaus Iohannis visited in June Kyiv together with President Macron, with the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Italy as well. So that kind of support Romania is ready to provide and will definitely provide it.
Thank you. We have exactly 13 minutes, and I promised I would get us to lunch on time. What I'd like to do is go down the line. Many questions have been raised, important questions, China, more on resource security and the like. If you could just take 2 minutes and pick whichever issue that was raised during the reactions and comment on that. I'm going to start with Ryan Guirlinger, please. 2 minutes to kind of hit whatever high point you think necessary.
Sure. I think on China, with Xi's visit to Moscow last week, certainly that's at the front of our minds. And it's a pivotal element as we consider, Ukraine and as we consider Russia. I mean, one thing that will be very interesting to watch is as we talk about the reconstruction or the reimagining, is what role does China play there? Because of the immense, financial resources, the activity in all sorts of markets all around the world, and how does that happen alongside its partnership or however we want to describe it with Moscow? And also what is, certainly we see, the state visit over 3 days compared with not even a phone call with President Zelensky, that just the wide disparity there between how China views, where it views itself in the conflict, and how does that, then play going forward. I think the U.S. administration has been very clear about, the possibility of China moving into lethal assistance to Russia, and that would essentially put us into a much different picture, probably globally. That then potentially changes a lot of elements on the ground, and then also in relations with China around the world. So certainly it's a key aspect, and then part of our efforts is trying to ensure that doesn't happen.
Great.
But that's been all a matter of normal diplomacy and leverage and everything else. So certainly something that we'll continue to be very focused on and keep a watch on.
Thank you. Honorable Consul Sanchez, 2 minutes.
Thank you. For me, what we have to stake now is to try to strengthen the foundations of the new reality among the Western countries themselves. So, to keep the determination, and to improve our system of cooperation. We've done in the military field, we have been shown, but we think we have a way ahead to try to tackle with the consequences of this new globalization, as I said, after COVID and after the war on Ukraine. We have to improve our response. Well, we can talk about China, but the best answer to China and to the rest of the world that doesn't follow our way of seeing things is, to show more commitment and more, cooperation among themselves.
Thank you very much. Honorable Consul Dumitrescu.
It's very difficult to pick a topic from many that we talked today. So I will say only that for Romania, a sovereign, powerful, independent, and European Ukraine is very important. Not only as a partner, but also from the security point of view. And we will provide the necessary support in order to touch those targets. At the same time, I think that consolidating resiliency of the Western democratic world countries is of utmost importance. We need to see and to learn from these history lessons. We are able to see that we cannot depend on the resources of only other countries of the world, and that we need to build our partnerships inside and outside our alliances based on the deep values of freedom, liberty, democracy, dignity, and respect for the world order based on rules and on international law.
Thank you very much. Honorable Consul Kushneruk.
What's the most important thing for Ukraine this year is to make sure of the timely and necessary supply of the military aid and ammunition, which we need to successfully fight the Russians. Because that's what I did not mention. That, for example, right now Russians are firing about 15,000 artillery ammo a day. We around 5,000 only, so 3 times less. And we need to increase that at least to 10,000 to try to reach the parity, and maybe think about the counteroffensive, which is so much discussed now. And the European Union has now committed supply of 1 million artillery ammo per year, and we're grateful for that. But with that use that we might have, is going to last maybe for 3 months only. So we need a bigger support for that. And in the meanwhile, of course, there's worth mentioning the peace proposals, which are currently arising from the visit of the big Asian country to Moscow. And we say that we should stick to the plan which was proposed by President Zelensky and which is enshrined in the United Nations resolution. because it not only includes what we already discussed, but also it has the requirements for withdrawal for Russian troops, restoration of territorial integrity, release of all prisoners of war, punishment for war crimes, and new global security architecture. Because in the peace plan, which was the other one, the alternative, it also has a request for respect for territorial integrity of all countries, for the ceasefire, and all things like that, which looks fine, yes, but it does not have any line about demands for Russia to withdraw its forces. So how can you ensure your territorial integrity if you have 350,000 foreign troops standing on your land? There is a contradiction in the plan by itself. And any ceasefire as for this moment will actually benefit Russia because it will allow them to freeze the war for their own benefit. And we should not allow that to happen. So there is no country in the world which wants peace more than Ukraine does, but first of all, the territorial integrity has to be restored, and all the country has to be free, and basically the safety in Europe has to be restored.
Thank you. Honorable Consul.
Well, just to refer to the subject of this conference, Ukraine 1 year later, I just hope that when we meet 2 years later, we're not going to have a discussion about providing munition, more about investment. That's what I hope for. But for the next months or how long it takes, I believe Poland will show its determination to continue with the assistance. And I think there was a topic of a change in elections and potential changes in the government. We're going to have elections this year, and Polish society is polarized on politics on many topics. But when it comes to the assistance to Ukraine, we stand united, and all parties in Poland do. So I'm sure that the policy that Poland has been presenting towards the Russian aggression, the help that needs to be provided to Ukraine will continue.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Siegel.
I'll keep my remarks really short. I think that solidarity comes with a price, and we need to figure out what that is. It also comes with commitment to time, and we also have to figure out what that is. And at the same, juncture, I really like what was said earlier, that this is the decision of Ukraine and Ukrainians. Despite all of these patron-client relationships and dependency and independency, it's ultimately the Ukrainians who are living and fighting and dying for their country. And I think that element of agency and that respect for Ukrainian voices in a polyphonic way, because there are serious disagreements about many things, I think at a very bare minimum, the US and the EU should respect that. And what the Ukrainians want, what the Zelensky government is actually pursuing, pay attention very closely to both domestic and foreign policy, the last point to which is that there's a huge brain drain and a human cost to all of this. And my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, they say to me almost unanimously, we want to go back. Or if we can't go back, we're going to do everything for this country that was unlawfully and aggressively nearly destroyed. Thank you.
Okay, I've been asked to just give closing remarks, and of course, how do you offer closing remarks on something like this, but I'll give it a shot. Just in this week alone, much has happened that warrants our attention. President Volodymyr Zelensky met with members of the World Bank, as we've talked about, and suggested that the cost to rebuild Ukraine would be in the range of $411 billion. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for President Vladimir Putin for the war crime of unlawful deportation of children and that of unlawful transfer of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. In his turn, President Putin announced that he plans to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. At the same time, President Putin, as we kind of played on the edges with, met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Many of us saw the images on the news, a clear message being sent from the Kremlin. Putin hosted the banquet for Xi in a 15th century palace within the Kremlin, where Tsars once celebrated their coronation and consecrated the top clergy of the Orthodox Church. This was certainly meant to recall Russia's imperial past. On the mural behind Putin and Xi, as the two toasted the enduring Sino-Russian cooperation, was Prince Vladimir of Kiev and Rus and his sons. As many of us know in this room, Prince Vladimir accepted Eastern Orthodoxy in 988 and drew Rus closer to Byzantium politically and economically. The Kremlin's message to the world was that this war is not just about NATO expansion or denazification, but about historical continuity. The version of history that Putin wants to continue to write is not the same version of history that the rest of the world wants to be written. As we all know, there is not just one history, not just one way to assemble the dates, the times, and the events of the past. Yet, if we do not understand Putin's historical perspective, then we cannot completely understand this crisis. Those who look at history in decades cannot comprehend when Putin harkens back to 988 or to the reign of Ivan the Terrible. As Orlando Figes, the British historian of Russia, has recently written in his book, quote, "No other country has reimagined its own past so frequently. None has a history so subjected to vicissitudes of ruling ideologies. History in Russia is political. Drawing lessons from the country's past has always been the most effective way to win an argument about future directions and policies. All the great debates about the country's character and destiny have been framed by questions about history," end quote. This is particularly the case in Putin's Russia, where there is only one political party and no competing ideologies to frame a debate. This is why I will take this moment to encourage those in the audience, especially our UVU students, to engage with the past critically. Understand not only the different ways in which to view our own history, the history of the United States, but the history of the world. This is the time to hone your skills to become better critical thinkers, better writers, more adept at crafting an argument and stating an informed opinion. Some have argued that we, and Professor Siegel noted this, are in a post-truth era in the 21st century. The understanding that objective facts are ignored in place of appeals to emotions and personal beliefs. I hope that we can reject this approach to allow emotions and personal beliefs to supersede critical thinking and the pursuit of knowledge. I encourage you to educate yourself, as we have done today, so that you can make informed opinions about what is happening in the world. The reason that this is important is that this war is not only being fought in Ukraine, it is being fought in the hearts and minds of people throughout the world. How long might the United States supply Ukraine with advanced weapons systems? Much of this is reliant on public opinion and the political resolve of our nation's leaders. So when Putin toasts Xi in a 15th century palace in the Kremlin, in front of a mural with the image of Prince Vladimir, this is a clear and deliberate act of political messaging. This is propaganda. This is an extenuation of the war in Ukraine. The reason that we have events like this one today is to counteract that kind of messaging, to inform and promote discussion, to help our students, our community, and our great state of Utah make informed opinions about what is happening in Ukraine, in Europe, and in the world. I want to thank you today for coming. I hope that you've gained a lot from our discussion. I know that I have. Please help me in thanking our guests on stage.